at bottom, regardless of the official label of citizen soldiers they had in the United States of Europe. Unfortunately, from Jesse's point of view, although it saved him a lot of grief in other ways, the Air Force didn't get too many volunteers from the committees of correspondence. He'd been surprised by that at first, since Hans Richter had been an airman and Hans was the poster boy for the COCs. But after a little experience, the reason had become obvious enough. Lots of enthusiastic COC members volunteered to become pilots like Hans Richter, sure enough. But in an Air Force that still only had a literal handful of planes, how many pilots did you need? What the Air Force mainly needed were people for the ground crews, and for all but a tiny number of COC firebrands, serving behind the lines doing what they saw as mostly menial chores just didn't appeal to them. One of the many American terms that had made its way into the hybrid, mostly German dialect of the new nation emerging in Central Europe was REMFs. Instead, they volunteered for the new regiments in the army Gustavus Adolphus was creating, which were sure to see action come next spring. So for the most part, Jesse had to make do with men, and some women here and there, who volunteered out of necessity rather than political fervor. Granted, that saved Jesse from having to deal with the rambunctious politics that saturated the new army regiments and had most downtime officers tearing out their hair. Most uptime officers, for that matter, were often just as aghast as their downtime counterparts at the radical conclusions their volunteers sometimes drew about the logic of democracy as applied to military discipline. So, true enough, Jesse was generally spared that problem. What he faced instead were the traditional ones of maintaining efficiency and discipline in a mercenary force, a problem that officers in the new army regiments rarely had to deal with. If a recruit in one of those regiments slacked off, he'd get disciplined by his COC mates before any officer even knew a problem existed, and the discipline could be a lot more savage than anything even a sergeant like Kruger would hand out. Jesse rubbed his eyes, pulled his leather jacket over his own brown flying suit, and grabbed the two often-used envelopes. Sweeping up his beret with its eagle insignia off his desk, he stretched his sore back and stepped out of his office into that of his adjutant. Lieutenant Cynthia Garlow was seated behind her desk, sharpening a goose-feather quill, her own computer showing a floral screensaver pattern. For reasons Jesse had never been able to grasp, she preferred using quill pens over the still perfectly functional modern pens that had come through the ring of fire in plenitude. She didn't stand up as he entered. She couldn't, having lost the use of her legs in a riding accident on the far side of the ring of fire. Instead, the former CAP cadet straightened to attention in her wheelchair and looked at Jesse expectantly. "Yes, Colonel?" Jesse smiled. "Cynthia, how many times have I told you to save the attention bit for visitors? It's just the two of us here, at ease for Pete's sake." Cynthia tossed her short auburn curls impatiently. "About 1,000,000 times, Colonel, almost as often as I've told you I can type faster than you, so why not just dictate to me?" She looked meaningfully at the envelopes in Jesse's hand. Jesse laid the envelopes on her desk. "Not this time, Lieutenant. This report was a pleasure to write. I've declared the Gustav flight tests completed. Now that we've finished those, the real fun begins. With luck and good weather, we'll have 6 trained crews by spring. Send the original to Mike Stearns in Government House on tomorrow's courier run to Magdeburg. The copy goes to Admiral Simpson." "Yes, sir. That's great news. Anything else?" "Yeah, send word to Major Horton that I'd like to see him in my quarters tonight at 20:30, will you? I'm going to take a turn around the base, then go home. Why don't you wrap up things here and take off?" Cynthia gave him an impish grin. "Why, thank you, sir. Friedrich promised to take me to dinner in town if we both got off early enough." Jesse nodded and wondered again at the dichotomy of Sergeant Kruger's renowned harshness to recruits and his obvious love for the crippled girl in the wheelchair. His gentleness and deference to her was an unceasing wonder to all who witnessed it. Cynthia was lovely, and doubtless her fluency in German helped, but still, Jesse was glad he hadn't found the need to institute any of the fraternization rules from the other timeline. Planting his beret on his head, eagle shining, he moved toward the door. "Evening, Cynthia." "Good evening, Colonel." Jesse stepped outside the newly constructed headquarters cum bachelor officers' quarters. Walking down the ramp built for Cynthia's use, he glanced down.